Now we will start our session. Our first presenter is Birol, and the title of the talk is Transmission and Reception of the Syriac Ahiqar Story.
Thank you. The story of the wise Ahiqar is one of the most frequently adapted and revised narratives in the literature of the ancient Near East. This is especially true of the Syriac version of the tale, which seems to have held particular significance for its readers and listeners. Nevertheless, the Syriac versions of the Ahiqar story poses us several puzzles. We are dealing with an ancient text that survives in its complete form only in relatively late manuscripts. Moreover, the text is scarcely referenced in Syriac literature, even though the story continued to circulate orally among Syriac communities. Additionally, while Ahiqar is widely recognized as a paragon of wisdom, there are only a few attestations that connect him to other known sages. The aim of my presentation is to contribute to a fuller understanding of Ahiqar in the Syriac tradition, and to explore how the story retained relevance among Syriacs despite the limited textual and historical evidence. The following will therefore address the textual transmission and reception of the work. But first, let us turn to its content. The narrative recounts how Ahiqar, a childless advisor and minister at the court of the Assyrian kings Sennacherib and Esarhaddon, is denied the hope of having offspring. At God's command, he adopts his nephew Nadan and trains him as his successor, instructing him through proverbial wisdom. However, Nadan conspires against his uncle and convinces the king to sentence Ahiqar to death. Ahiqar's executioner secretly spares his life and hides him. Later, when the pharaoh challenges the Assyrian king with a riddle Nadan cannot solve, the king learns of Ahiqar's survival. Ahiqar is rehabilitated, travels to Egypt to solve the riddle, and return triumphant. As a reward, he receives custody of Nadan, whom he punishes with moral rebuke and physical torture until the latter dies. When the Syriac and Arabic versions of the Ahiqar story first became widely known to Western scholars in the late 19th century, the historical value was initially debated. At that time, Ahiqar was known only from the Old Testament, particularly the Book of Tobit, leading some to speculate that the Syriac version derived from Tobit. One scholar even dated its composition to the 7th or 8th century CE. This skepticism was reinforced by the absence of the Ahiqar story in the earliest Syriac manuscript collections then housed in the British Museum and the Vatican Library. However, the discovery of Aramaic Ahiqar sayings at Elephantine soon overturned this view, establishing the Syriac version as one of the oldest extant non-Christian texts in Syriac. Further support came with the 1959 discovery of a tablet from Uruk, mentioning a court scholar named Ahiqar during the reign of Esarhaddon. The Syriac and Arabic versions of the Ahiqar story occupy a primary position among the extant textual traditions. Although earlier fragments exist in Aramaic, Demotic, and more recently Sogdian in Syriac script, only the Syriac and Arabic versions preserve the full narrative, including its frame story. Moreover, all later versions in languages such as Armenian and Church Slavonic are thought to derive from these two traditions. The Ahiqar story is preserved both in classical Syriac and in Neo-Aramaic dialects. However, the Neo-Aramaic versions were all translated from Arabic and are therefore excluded from considerations of the original Syriac tradition. This observation is confirmed by previous scholarly studies and independent comparisons. For classical Syriac, the situation is different. 22 manuscripts have been identified and can be broadly divided into Eastern and Western Syriac textual traditions. Three are considered lost, and one, dated 1965, is a copy of a printed edition and thus excluded from the study. Rather than examining the genealogical relationship, which is complicated, among these witnesses in detail, this presentation will focus on the insights derived from those relationships. The remaining 18 textual witnesses are divided as follows. On the left side of the image are the Western Syriac manuscripts, with the oldest being Zachau 162 from the 15th century. This manuscript is heavily damaged and breaks off in the middle of the sayings. The two other Western Syriac manuscripts preserve only the sayings, although Aleppo CAA 7/229 also includes the moral exhortation. The remaining manuscripts belong to the Eastern Syriac tradition. Except for the earliest fragment, British Library Additional 7200, the rest can be geographically located. One line of transmission is rooted in Urmia, Iran, where it remained active until the early 20th century. The most important witness is Cambridge Additional 2020, which served as the base for the editions by Connie Beer et al. Another textual branch is found in northern Iraq, characterized by additions and explanations absent in the Urmia tradition, such as attributing Ahiqar's earlier veneration of pagan gods as the reason for his childlessness. The northern Iraqi tradition includes two manuscripts, which shows great influence from back translation from Arabic. Comparison with the oldest fragment suggests the Urmia tradition is closer to the original version. What can be inferred from this qualification? Among the West Syriacs, the transmission of the Ahiqar story in classical Syriac is limited to only a few manuscript witnesses. This limited preservation explains why Bishop Philoxenos Yohanna Dolabani, one of the foremost experts in West Syriac manuscripts, based his 1929 printed edition on the first edition by Connie Beer et al., which was drawn from an East Syriac manuscript. Lacking better witnesses within the West Syriac tradition, he copied, corrected, and published that version. However, the Ahiqar story is still well preserved in West Syriac manuscript collections, but not in classical Syriac, foremost in Arabic and Karshuni. Within the East Syriac tradition, two trends are observable. The older form of the Ahiqar story is preserved in the Urmia tradition, while in northern Iraq, the text seems to have survived only partially, often through retranslation from Arabic. This, however, also highlights the continued significance of the text into the late 19th century, enough to warrant its reconstruction via retranslation. This is also evident from the fact that before the 19th century, the story is preserved only in fragments, whereas in the 19th century there was a real boom in its transmission. However, I will now return to the reception history of the Ahiqar story in Syriac literature, which is relatively limited. In fact, only two Syriac authors are known to mention Ahiqar by name. The most important is Avdisho bar Bricha. He wrote in both Syriac and Arabic, and his extant works include The Pearl, a systematic exposition of East Syriac theology, a nomocanon compiling synodal decrees, and a collection of theological poetry titled Paradise of Eden. Although Avdisho's metrical catalogue of books is a crucial source on Syriac authors and texts, many of which are now lost, it does not mention Ahiqar or his story. Ahiqar appears only in his book Paradise of Eden, where he is praised for his wisdom. In one verse, Avdisho writes, quotation, "It is fitting for a chosen one to humble himself like Macarius, to be patient and to have wisdom like Ahiqar." The verse employs an embracing rhyme, Iqar, Suqar, Maqar, Ahiqar, possibly highlighting Ahiqar's name for emphasis. Apart from Avdisho, only Hassan Barbakhlul refers to Ahiqar in his Syriac Arabic lexicon. Due to the lack of other Syriac authors mentioning the name Ahiqar, one could assume that the Ahiqar story has received little attention from Syriacs in the past. However, that Ahiqar's legacy is more than a fleeting phenomenon is confirmed by the manuscript Hunter 40, a 15th century manuscript preserved in the University Library of Glasgow. It is a medical compendium by Abu Ali Yahya ibn Isa ibn Jazla from 11th century, introduced with this illustration depicting 4 figures identified by marginal notes from right to left: Aristotle, Galen, Plato, and Ahiqar. A further inscription at the left margin reads, "These are the sages who know God." Also, a look at 2 other texts seems to confirm this. Here we find the probable inclusion of sayings from the Ahiqar story in a different context. Besides, it is not noted in these texts that they originate from the narrative of Ahiqar. It should be stressed here that the area of intertextuality for the Syriac versions of the Ahiqar text requires further study in order to provide a clearer picture of the interdependencies. Now I reveal how 2 examples of possible individual sayings from the Ahiqar narrative are incorporated, contextualized, and used in other texts. The first example comes from the so-called Dog Decalogue, a monastic East Syriac text from late antiquity. It survives only in one manuscript, India Office number 9 in the British Library, dated to the 17th century and containing 84 theological and liturgical tracts. The author and date of origin remain unknown. Ahiqar's saying inserted after saying 10 in brackets is clearly a later addition. Though its wording differs from other versions, the style is consistent and its core message remains intact. As Peter Bruns notes, it likely serves as a supplement to sayings 4, 5, and 8. The inclusion shows that Ahiqar's wisdom was well known and seen as relevant despite conflicting with modern views on animal ethics. The second possible reference to an Ahiqar saying appears in the Testament of Ephraim the Syrian. Though all manuscripts attribute the text to Ephraim, Edmund Beck, an authority on his writings, confirms it is not genuinely his. The true author remains unknown. The earliest manuscript dates to the 7th or 8th century, placing the composition before that time. This is notably given that the oldest Syriac manuscript of the Ahiqar narrative dates to the 12th century, making Ephraim's testament some 400 years earlier. While Ahiqar's saying is not quoted verbatim, its style and phrasing are clearly echoed, with some wording adapted to suit the author's message. The Testament of Ephraim is framed as a farewell address in which Ephraim reflects on his life and offers pastoral advice to his disciples. In the relevant section, he warns against heretical teachings, but illustrates that those who stray can still return to the truth. The first image he uses is adapted from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 4, and is explicitly marked as biblical. The second, however, lacks any source attribution. This latter image likely reflects an adapted saying from Ahiqar. To illustrate this, we will first examine Ahiqar's original saying, followed by its reworked form in Ephraim's testament. Ahiqar saying 62. My son, if the water should stand up without ground, and the sparrow fly without wings, and the raven become white as snow, and the bitter turn sweet as honey, then the fool would become wise. Now the testament of Ephraim. So it may also happen that a denier became instructed. If a raven can turn white, then a wicked man becomes a righteous man. The relationship between the texts is evident and requires little explanation. However, it becomes clear that the testament's author likely adopts the saying and not vice versa, especially in the following passage where he even partially counters Ahiqar's statement. Perhaps snow falls in winter and piles up on the raven's feathers, and it becomes white for some time. The raven threw the snow on its wings. So it may happen that the wicked hear the voice of judgment and be afraid of the torment, and turn away from their works. Listen, my disciples, to my precepts, and do not depart from my faith. First, the author retains Ahiqar's synthetic style by beginning with the typical en, if. This marks a stylistic shift, though the message remains, a misguided person may still find truth. In Ahiqar's story, the white raven symbolizes near impossibility. Here, the author reverses the image by citing examples like a raven turning white from snow. He adapts the image to support his point, though it doesn't fully align with the content or tone of the testament. The idea that a false teacher may still reach truth fits only loosely with Pseudo-Ephraim's following exhortation for his disciple to remain faithful. Foreign texts have also been inserted into the Syriac Ahiqar story, as seen in the later Mosul manuscript DFM 430. The saying, quotation, "Be humble in your youth and obedient so that you will be honored in old age," stylistically contrasts with Ahiqar's other sayings, which typically describe what one should not do. This phrase appears in another pseudepigraphical word attributed to Ephraim the Syrian. Late northern Iraqi manuscripts show another addition. After Pharaoh's letter to the Assyrian king, the people of Assyria and Nineveh flee to Egypt due to tribal demands. Yet, when Ahiqar travels to Egypt, the sources state the Assyrians return home. This may reflect the late 19th century Syriac emigration, likely added by copists. According to Aleda Asman's wisdom categories, Ahiqar exemplifies judicial or kingly wisdom, a mix of knowledge, power, and courage, also reflected in his divine communication, choice of successor, instructions to his executioner and wife, and duel with the Pharaoh. His triumph above the Pharaoh symbolizes the community's hope for a sage who can solve contemporary problems in the 19th century. Though Ahiqar's name fades from Syriac literature, his sayings survive in other texts. He initially represents wisdom itself, a notion supported by oral tradition. The Glasgow manuscript Hunter 40 illustration and the Ahiqar saying in the Dog Decalogue. This shows that while Ahiqar's saying were valued as a wise guidance, scribes still adapted and reinterpreted them. For instance, the Testament of Ephraim transforms Ahiqar's image of a black raven into a white one covered in snow. The Ahiqar narrative presents an idealized sage embodying timeless, multifaceted wisdom, serving as an epitome of wisdom itself. Ahiqar's broad appeal likely explains why this ancient narrative remains popular and relevant among Syriacs today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have time for questions and answers.
tribe called Ahiqar. But there is Nabu, Zaqab, Akina, Ishtar, Shum, Irish. No, Ahiqar.
I didn't get your point. Can you repeat probably the question?
يعني من خلال اختصاصي هذا طبعا كتابة اسماعيلية شوية من خلال التذييلات كولوفونس المكتشفة في قصري الملكين سنحاريب وابنه أسرحدون، ومن خلال التذييلات يكتب بالنهاية اسم الكاتب. لدينا 4 مردوك شوم أقيشة، لدينا نابو شلمشونو، لدينا رؤساء الكتاب لي أسرحدون نابو زقر أكينا هذا رئيس كتبة سنحاريب، ولدينا إشتر شوم إريش رئيس كتبة أسرحدون. لا يوجد أحقاق من بينهم.
He says we have the names, the list with names of writers of these kings mentioned, Sanharib, Asarhadun, but the name of Ahiqar is not mentioned anywhere in cuneiform.
I have mentioned that there's the table of Uruk in 1959. There is Ahiqar Manu.
شفات الدولة الآشورية دكتور شاو.
يحكي في أوروك رقم فلان فلان.
أوروك يعني الفترة السلوكية هذه متأخرة هذه. أوروك يعني الفترة السلوكية وليس أوروك الآشورية.
سلجوك بريول.
Before this.
هذه القرن الخامس قبل الميلاد. بالفترة الإخمينية تسربت مخطوطات آرامية لأساطير أو شخصيات أسطورية لا وجود لها على أرض الواقع، أنه لم يكونوا موجودين من بينهم.
He wants to say, he wants to say that the name Ahiqar is not mentioned in that early period with the king related or linked to the kings mentioned.
Yeah.
Of course, it is in Uruk you mentioned, it is from the 5th century, this is later, so, but we don't have...
It is 5th century before Christ.
You see, yeah, 5th century, this is what he said.
Yeah.
Okay, other questions?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Totally different remark. In Trier, we find the mosaics there. I don't know, did you visit it? Where the name of Ahiqar is...
Yes, but it has been shown that this has nothing to do with the Ahiqar story.
No, it doesn't, but this, the claim is basically that at that time, probably already in the 3rd century, people from the east, because near Trier one can find also some graves of Eastern people like Aziz and so on. One believes that there were already people from the Middle East, being Christian or not Christian is not clear, but one of them could have come with this known story of Ahiqar, and when they tried to present on that mosaic, sort of the philosophers and the science and wisdoms, and one of them is Ahiqar, but his name is not fully written, characters are missing.
Yeah, and the position today is that this is not our Ahiqar. This is something like that.
Okay. What would be the reason?
It was can't remember it, but they, according to this, the writing, they think that this has nothing to do with our Ahiqar. There's another name, but I didn't remember the name.
Okay, this surprised me. Secondly, now if we're looking at the wisdom of Ahiqar, I mean, I grew up with it, reading it like farm stories, you see, as a child, and we could read it, of course, a lot of the phrases, how Ahiqar teaches nephew, basically, and so on. It's like wisdom which you heard them in colloquial way of educating children in Turaqin. It was very much close to it.
But to interrupt you, the interesting thing is that the proverbs were not transmitted in the manuscript, in the oral origin in the manuscript that we have in the New Aramaic dialects, not in the Turoyo manuscript, and also not in the Syriac one.
But my question is, you quote Ephraim, and this phrase is basically of like a foolish, etc., cannot become wise, and so on. This is, in a way, if you transfer it to the in theological context, to the sinners who sin and do mistake, basically you exclude the possibility that they can repent
Yes.
and became faithful. I mean, how does Ephraim deal with it? And do you know much more about it? I mean, it would contradict actually his genuine teaching.
Yes, yes, because it's a pseudo-Ephraic work, so it's not genuine by Ephraim. So the author who said that he's Ephraim uses this image and put it in his words. So this text has, okay, he says the author is Ephraim, but the author is not Ephraim.
Thank you so much for your topic. I want to ask you about characters was mentioned in Quran. Luqman.
Yeah.
Do you find any relationship between Luqman and Ahiqar?
There is a relationship, but it is more closely adapted in the Arabic tradition. There is the relationship is clearer there. The description of Ahiqar as the wisdom figure, to compare it with Luqman, is there are studies on it. So, yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you, Simon. As far as I understood, again, we all the Aramaic forms we have, variations of the text, are of Arabic origin.
Yes.
So the Ahiqar tradition actually disappeared among the people. Is this correct? The genuine, the Syriac one.
Yes, the Syriac one is.
So they reintroduced the Arabic one in the 19th century.
We didn't know from the time the original oral tradition came. So we can't say is it 19th, 18th century, but in the 19th century we have a new wave asking for Ahiqar.
Yes, and all of them are based on Arabic.
Yes.
Wherever they are, from Urmia till
Yes.
Lasso.
Yes, and you have in these, for instance, in these three written New Aramaic manuscripts, every time Arabic text and Syriac text.
Oh, thank you. Just wanted to underline.
Thank you.
You're very punctual. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now our second presenter is Miroslav Rucki. And the title of the talk is References to Syriac in Talmud.
No, but we need No, but it works only with the stick. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to me to make my presentation before you, and thank you very much for inviting me. My name is Miroslaw Rucki. I'm from Poland, Radom University, and I will share with you my observations about reference to Syriac in Talmud. As an introduction, I just want to remind you, I think most of you know about that region Adia Bene and its capital Arbailu are supposed to receive the first Jewish exiles from Israel and Judah, moved by the rulers of Neo-Assyrian Empire. And this event initialized millennia-long mutual influence between Hebrew and Aramaic dialects, including Syriac, of course. And in some extent, Jewish contacts with Syriac are reflected in Talmud, which is discussed in the present paper. But maybe not everybody knows what is Talmud, so I would just remind you again that the Babylonian Talmud, Talmud Bavli, was compiled between 3rd and 6th centuries of Common Era involving rabbis from the most important Jewish academic centers in Mesopotamia. It was Nehardea, perhaps it was Anbar, Nisibis, Mahoza, nobody knows where is Mahoza, maybe it was Al-Madain, Pumbedita, and Sura. In fact, Jewish rabbis were writing their things, their treatise, thinking that everybody knows everything about it. It's a joke like that. A Jew came to a rabbi and asked, why do we Jews wear always kippah on our heads? And rabbi says, because it's written in the Torah. Where? Here you can read. And Moses stood before God. And the Jew asks, how it's related to the kippah? And rabbi lost his temper and told, can you imagine Moses standing before God without a kippah? So, can you imagine anybody who don't know where is Pumbedita, for example? Rabbis didn't imagine. So, let's just turn to the methodology. The text from rabbinic literature from 1st to 6th centuries, which are Talmud, Bavli, and Yerushalmi, Midrash Rabbah, and some related works were analyzed, were took into consideration. And the following aspects I considered: geography and related terms, personal and language context between Jews and Syriac people, and reference to Syriac Aramaic language and its usage. And also I found some words, Syriac or Aramaic, in the rabbinic discussions, but I wasn't able to investigate dialectal features of the Aramaic Talmud and related words. Maybe somebody will help me with this in the future. First of all, geography. The word Ashur appears in Hebrew Bible 151 times. So it was a very important place, and it was recalled in the very beginning. Where is it? Genesis, in the book of Genesis, to set the most important, the oldest location. Additionally, it's a different form, Ashura. It appears 6 times. And in Targums, we can find also in the form Atur. Atur is apparently corresponding with the Peshitta version Atur, like that. And we can read in the Bible that Rabshakeh spoke with inhabitants of Jerusalem using Jewish language, Yehudit, instead of Aramaic. Common people did not speak Aramaic in Jerusalem, but we understand that Jewish elites knew Aramaic well, so they spoke with Rabshakeh this language. And also we can read in the book of Kings about Naaman HaArami, which is in Targum of Yonatan called Naaman Aramoyo, Aramai, yes, and in New Testament in Greek version Naaman Hosiros, he became Syrian, not Aramean, in the Greek translation, in the word of Jesus, and in Peshitta he became again Naaman Aramoyo. And in the 1st century, this region, which was known previously as Aram, was called Syria. For example, Rabban Gamliel, who was teacher of St. Paul, he died before 70 CE, he went to ask permission for some communal matters from a Roman officer in Syria, Shabasuria. It was written in Bavli Sanhedrin. We can see in this map that the region was occupied by Roman forces in about 45 before Christ, 44. And noteworthy, Jastrov, in his dictionary, Mark Jastrov, noted the version Atur, which is clearly corresponding with Syrian toponym connected with Mosul region. So when they spoke about Ashur, it was ancient thing, but when Atur, probably it was the region they knew themselves, and they heard how Syriac people called this place. And the word Syria is apparently taken from Greek Syria, because in Talmud it was meant a region of several distinct districts situated northeast of Palestine, sharing in many respects the sanctity of the Holy Land. But this respect was, how to say, a little fused, because some things were permitted in Syria but not permitted in Israel. It's about Jewish kashrut. It's not possible to explain you some details in so a short time. And also, Romans installed in Syria arkaot, which were judges who were considering to judge Jewish people, but Jewish people considered them not binding. In contrast to Jewish experts, mumchin. Mumchin were Jewish judges who were competent to judge Jewish matters. And a very, very interesting thing is called Hashrikin Asurin. I don't know what is that. It's a cake which is made in form of something. And in my imagination, I see this sort of cakes made in a Jewish town, Kazimierz Dolny, in Poland. And perhaps it was a little like that. Maybe somebody will know what is Hashrikin Asurin. It is mentioned in several places in Talmud. And it is obviously connected with Assur, with Syriac people. And now, for the clarification, also in some matters, Jewish people went to Syria, and they also referred to the border between a Roman state and Syria, the Syria which they knew in that time. And perhaps I think it can be that after the fall of Assyrian Empire, and especially after the Babylonian exile, Jews distinguished between Babylonia and Syria. So the place Babylon, Bab-el, it was northern Iraq, so to say, and Syria was Syria for them, and they distinguished, for example, in Mishneh Torah, we can read that they name three regions: Shinar, Syria, and Mitzrayim, Egypt. So these three regions were the places where Jews lived: Israel, and they were expelled to Syria and Shinar, Babylon, and also they migrated to Egypt when they wanted to escape the Babylonian army. And these were distinct regions for them. And now we can speak a little about personal and language contacts, because this geography made Jewish people mixed with Aramaic and Syriac speaking peoples. And perhaps the first who brought Judaism to Syria was Naaman, whom I mentioned. However, in Talmud Bavli, rabbis said that he was not a true convert. He was a ger toshav, who was making some things like Torah demands, but other not. And they compared him with Nabuzaradan, who was an officer of a Babylonian army, and they ascribed to him that he killed 200,000 people, and after that he converted. And rabbis described how he contemplated the idea of repentance, teshuvah, and how he became a convert, and at last he became a righteous proselyte, ger tzedek. And apparently the most prominent Assyrian converts, these were rabbis Shemaiah and Avtalion. They are called the sons of Sennacherib. Of course, there are many theories who they were. They were probably not descendants of King Sennacherib, but in Jewish perception, they were still people connected with an Assyrian king who destroyed 46 cities of Judah. And in fact, they were ones who introduced the new method of derush, biblical interpretation. And they were first who were called Darshanim Gedolim, the great expounders who explained the Bible this way, derush. And Hillel the Babylonian, Hillel the Great, was their pupil, and he laid down the hermeneutical rules. And his sayings are preserved in Aramaic, the language of the people, which language they called the Babylonian language, not Aramaic or Syriac, but Babylonian. By the way, Ephraim the Syrian represented the poetic genre called Madrosho, which I think is stemmed from the Derush introduced by Shemaiah and Avtalion, who were great rabbis of their time. Of course, we know about King Monobas of Adiabene and his mother Helena, who embraced Judaism around 1st century of CE Common Era. But there are also other prominent people of Assyrian, Syriac background mentioned in Talmud. For example, from Adiabene, Hadiab came two unnamed scholars who brought their own Baraita explanation of some important things. Rabbi Jacob of Adiabene, Rabbi Zoga from Adiabene were named also. And one of the most important was Rabbi Mar Ukba, who lived and taught in Adiabene. And his saying is recorded in Bavli Sanhedrin that Mar Ukba said, originally the Torah was given to Israel in Hebrew characters and the sacred Hebrew language. He used here the word Ivri. And later, in the times of Ezra, the Torah was given in Ashurit script and Aramaic language. And finally, they selected for Israel the Ashurit script and Hebrew language, leaving the Hebrew characters and Aramaic language to Hadiot. And because time is too small, I will speak about the reference to Syriac and Aramaic and some words that we can find in Talmud. It is very interesting that because of changing the language environment during exile, rabbis were very interested in defining which language they should use. And they tried to understand how it works in the world. And they named Syriac language, Sursi, as a language good for elegies, while Hebrew was good for speech, and Assyrian was good for writing. It was their classification. And the Assyrian, in fact, it was Aramaic, Imperial Aramaic script was borrowed during the exile, and they called it Ashurit. Ashurit in many places is called this so-called quadrat script. And among rabbis, we find strong opposition against embracing Aramaic. But some rabbis said that Adam was the first man who spoke Aramaic also. I just mentioned that in medieval Poland there were theologians who said that Adam spoke Polish. But it was invention of Jews that he spoke Aramaic. And perhaps they refer to Galilean Aramaic in the following discussion when they say, in Eretz Israel, in Israel, why should people speak the tongue of Syriac, Sursi? Why they speak it in Israel? Perhaps it was Galilean Aramaic, not Syriac strictly. Rather, they should speak either the sacred tongue, Hebrew, or in Greek. And obviously, Sursi is distinguished from Aramaic spoken in Babylonia. The same Galilean Aramaic was used in the court where Abba Bar Zutra served. It is in Yerushalmi Nedarim recalled. And Rabbi Levi Bar Haita, who lived in the second half of the 2nd century, was astonished hearing in synagogue at Caesarea when Shema was recited in Hellenistic manner. Shema Israel, you should recite only in Hebrew, not Hellenistic, barbaric Greek. And this sparkled a discussion how people should pray. And they found that prayer should be, when people ask God for something, it can be in vernacular, but other parts of the prayer should be in Hebrew. And interestingly, the Rabbi Yehuda said a person should never request that his need be met in the Aramaic language. Why? Because the angels who bring our prayers to God, they don't speak Aramaic. They are Hebrew angels. It was the explanation. At the same time, Rav Yehuda says that Adam was the first man spoke Aramaic. He had background for this to prove how it was. Because in the psalm, which is related to Adam, it is said, how weighty also are your thoughts to me, O God. How weighty is my Yikra? It's perhaps related to the Syriac word Ahiqar. Yeah, Ahiqar. It's some sort of to be heavy, yes. And also the thoughts, it's more interesting word because this word appears in Hebrew Bible only once. Ra, in this meaning. So also I didn't find notification by Yastrov that in Jewish Aramaic this word was known. So rabbis thought that it can be Rai from Syriac. I think it's a very Syriac word and perhaps the only one which can be identified as a Syriac word. And please remember that it is not about the wording of psalms. Yes, it is about Jewish rabbinic perception of the language and psalm, what they read and what they hear. And since we have only 2 minutes, I will not say about all these not many words which are in Aramaic. Perhaps many of them can be treated as Babylonian Aramaic or Galilean Aramaic. I think maybe this Ra was the only one which can be found Syriac. Just to explain that why the word sursi not always referred to Syriac. For example, they say, I'm sorry, just a moment. Yes, Rabbi Samuel Bar Nachman said that Syriac language should not be unimportant in your eyes, for it is mentioned in the Torah, the prophets, and the hagiographs. In Torah, Laban called it heap of testimony. Yegar Sahaduta, he said it is Syriac, maybe because Laban lived in Haran, which is close to Edessa, where Syriac dialect emerged from. But he also say in prophets, and he is citing Jeremiah, the entire verse in Aramaic, which is not Syriac, obviously. And also he is citing Book of Daniel, and the Book of Daniel is not in Syriac. It is rather Imperial Aramaic, this Aramaic part. But he called all these passages as Syriac. So, to make the long story short, I just present my conclusions. Talmud and related Jewish writings made numerous references to Assyria, Syria, Aramaic language, and Syriac especially. And usually they used term Assyria, Ashur, to denote the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and Syria, Surya, or Suria, for its western regions associated with Greek Seleucid kingdom, especially the ones later included to the Roman Empire. And the square script borrowed from Hebrew from Imperial Aramaic is called Ashurit, Assyrian, perhaps due to incorporation of Palestine to the Roman province of Syria. Palestinian Aramaic dialect was referred to as Sursi or Suristin. And Syriac may be meant specifically in some texts, but there is no clear and consistent distinction between Aramaic dialects. The term Aramid and Sursi could be used interchangeably. Some Syriac words and meaning are referred to in the rabbinic discussions on biblical passages and commandments, and numerous personal contacts with Osroene and Adiabene regions confirm the mutual influence between the Jewish and Syriac peoples and dialects. Here you can see some reference, and thank you for your attention, and I will be happy to try to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. Now we get to ask questions. Many questions.
That's great.
Thank you. Two questions. One is about the use of the terms Asuria and Surya in the Talmud. What dates can they be dated to securely? And which one is used earlier, or are they used interchangeably?
It's absolutely impossible to find out.
Okay.
Because Talmud was not written in parts. They always added something somewhere, and it is impossible. Everything is mixed. It is impossible to find the stratus.
So then what's the earliest date for the composition of the Talmud?
There is no earliest date. They started at the end of the 1st century and finished at the end of 5th century.
1st century BC or AD?
CE.
CE.
Yeah.
Okay.
After the destruction of the temple.
Okay, and I remember reading somewhere that the word Sursi was a pejorative. Instead of saying Suri or Surit,
they would call it sursi in order to make fun of it. It means something else in Hebrew, I can't remember. But it was
Yes, Mark Yastro wrote that it was pejorative, but when I checked in Talmud, I didn't find anything which confirmed it. It's just a name of the language.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question about Naaman. So, in the Peshitta, he is called the general of the king of Edom, if I'm not mistaken. So, I wanted to ask whether you have any kind of these echoes in the Talmud or...
No, in Talmud I found only that they called him Arami. And nothing else. But about Edom, it's very difficult to say because there are very many similar words in Talmud. For example, Rumi, it can be Arami or Roman. The word Rumi, they used in order sometimes to make a code not understandable to the Roman authorities. Yeah? So they can call him Edomi because he was somewhere else, not in the Syria, you know. But it is not, I'm not sure, it should be investigated.
So it cannot be a scribal mistake, Edom for Aram in Hebrew? Because of the similarity of the letters?
It can be, yes, it can be too, as one of the hypotheses.
Michael Weizmann addressed this problem in his book about Peshitta.
Thank you so much. A very encyclopedic presentation. A few comments. The first is a bit of a historical one. It seemed to me that you were taking seriously either the rabbinic claims that certain biblical figures converted, or that Shemaiah and Avtalion were real people, not legendary characters, and that they were actually influential in Babylonia. I don't think that's the scholarly consensus anymore. I think we now think that the rabbis were fairly marginal throughout late antiquity, and certainly these earlier figures are almost certainly legendary. In terms of Lashon Sursi, there's the famous David Taylor article on bilingualism, where he shows that these terms, even in Syriac, don't mean Syriac. Right, so Syrian, Syriac, these words are always confused. Theodoret of Cyrus, I think, says that there are 25 dialects of Syrian, Syriac. So who knows what they really mean? In the Bavli, I don't think at any point do they contrast Lashon Arami and Lashon Sursi. They're used in different contexts, and I think that's for a reason.
But in the one passage, they make a distinction.
Two different rabbis do. First Rav Yosef, and then a different rabbi. One in Eretz Yisrael and one in Babel. So it's always distinguished.
Of course.
And I guess the larger comment is, with respect, this is like a growing field now. There's quite a lot of scholarship here. And I'm surprised that you're using Jastrow and not Sokolov, who's far superior than Jastrow. I mean, we've come quite a long way in the 100 years since Jastrow. So we have quite a lot of research since then. In terms of connections between Syriac and the Talmud, Syriac Christians and Talmud, we have Michal Barsher Sigal, Adam Becker, Jeffrey Herman, myself. I mean, people have been working on this. And then in terms of Syriac language, you have Sokolov, but you also have Christian Stadel and other people. So there's a lot of work here that's been done already, and I think it should be updated to reflect that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. About Shemaiah and Avtalion, I don't mean here to discuss about the guys, but I speak about perception of Jewish rabbis in the time of Talmud. They were sure that they were true people who were descendants of Sanherib, and it was very important for them to make new connection between Assyrian Syriac people and themselves. And this is the point.
Thank you. Very sorry, there are several more questions, but I hope you guys continue to discuss after the session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now, Alexander Edmonds will present with the title, The Last of Gilgamesh. a Mesopotamian king in Theodore bar Kunais, Dabar de Escolium.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes.
Yeah, one second. Because I'm plugging. I'll just let the picture appear before I speak to you. Jolly good. Is the microphone there?
Oh, yes, this one.
All right. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm an Assyriologist by trade. I don't normally do Aramaeans after the birth of Christ, normally Aramaeans long before he was around. And as a result, I'm jumping a little bit out of my comfort zone, so please be patient with me. This research was conducted as part of the ERC-funded project Governance in Babylon, the University of Munster, and I'd like to thank the Assyrian Cultural Foundation for funding my travel here. Good, those are the niceties over, and let's... What just happened?
This is not the pointer.
This is not the pointer? Why?
This is the pointer, and this is the next. And here you close it.
Oh, I closed it. Sorry, I put finger on roughing. There we are. Sorry about the anticlimax. So, here we go. Let's start quickly. Then, the first point is, who is Gilgamesh? This is very obvious to me, but I thought I'd quickly recapitulate it for those of you who are not all that knowledgeable about Mesopotamian literature. Gilgamesh is a very central figure within both Sumerian and Akkadian literature, and he permeates essentially everything to do with the ancient Near East. He was around from the earliest textual documentation that we have, and he is still around at the very end of cuneiform culture. And very quickly to recapitulate what happens in the story, for those of you who don't know it, of course, Gilgamesh is the king of Uruk, which is modern-day Warka in southern Iraq. The problem is that he has far too much libido. He runs around causing problems, and this becomes such an issue that the people of Uruk pray to the gods that somebody can come to balance him out. So what happens then is that they send a wild man called Enkidu to the sort of the steppes, who is then captured by a hunter and a prostitute and brought to Uruk, and there he subdues Gilgamesh. They wrestle and become friends. What happens after that then is that they carry on to a cedar forest. Originally this was in the Zagros in the earliest version of the story, but it becomes Lebanon by the Old Babylonian period, and there they kill an ogre called Humbaba who is guarding the forest, and what happens as a result when they bring back the timber is that they incur the wrath of the gods. This only gets worse when Gilgamesh turns down Ishtar, the goddess of love, and as a result, she sends a bull of heaven. You can see, by the way, in the cylinder seals to the side, the top one has the killing of Humbaba, and the bottom one has the killing of the bull of heaven. And as a result of this, then, it is decided that Enkidu must die. So he dies, and then Gilgamesh wanders the countryside in mourning, trying to seek immortality. He travels all the way to the end of the world through a complicated series of events and ends up meeting Utanapishtim, who's essentially the Babylonian version of Noah, who tells him the story of the flood, but says, I'm sorry, you can't become immortal like I did because the flood only happens once. So instead, there is a plant where if you get this plant, you can live forever. He gets the plant, but then unfortunately a snake eats it, and so ends the story with Gilgamesh accepting his own mortality, that we are all fated to die. This story, really, the earliest attestation, I've put it at the top here because this chart from Lambert is a little bit old, the earliest attestation of a Gilgamesh-like figure is 2600 BC, so it's really at the very beginning of true literature. And the latest attestation is 130 BC on a dated colophon of a tablet from Uruk. This is from the Parthian period, so it shows that really Gilgamesh is there for the entire duration of Mesopotamian history. But as you can see from this chart, originally there's a series of smaller Sumerian stories which then sort of coagulate together into an epic by the Old Babylonian period, which then in turn is transmitted throughout the Near East. It goes as far afield as Hattusha, for example, and also to Megiddo, because it was part of scribal training, part of the syllabus you'd have to learn as a scribe during the Middle Bronze Age. By the Iron Age, a new recension of the story is composed called Shah Nagba Imaru, He Who Viewed the Deep, which has a much more pessimistic tone than the Old Babylonian version, which is a very rousing sort of warlike story. In this version, Gilgamesh is much more contemplative about death, and it's this composition which survives until the very end of cuneiform culture. It's important to mention that Gilgamesh also appears in a lot of other contexts, including in incantations. He was also a judge in the underworld, and there's also things such as a fictitious letter of his we'll talk about later, which is also connected to the whole business. So if we map quickly where the last attestations in cuneiform, not in Aramaic, in cuneiform are of Gilgamesh, we have a map like this. And you will notice that there is there's a dividing line, of course, here. West of the Euphrates, as far as we know, there are no attestations in cuneiform of the Gilgamesh story after the late Bronze Age. But this could just be an accident of discovery. There could be something out there waiting to be found. Anyway, so that's all of the cuneiform attestations. But now we enter rather unknown territory, the Aramaic and Greek attestations of Gilgamesh. And this is a very little researched field. However, it's very fascinating, and this is a point where me, as someone with essentially Assyriological training, jumps out of his comfort zone, and I open myself up to your critique, but that's sort of the point. So, the first question then is, how might Gilgamesh or similar have been transmitted into Aramaic? Now, as a lot of research recently has shown, in fact, Aramaic was being used very early already alongside Akkadian in the Neo-Assyrian Empire. In fact, there's a reference I've managed to find, published quite recently, which shows that already in 890 BC, Aramaic was being used in official correspondence by Assyrian kings. And there's a very nice little accident that we have surviving in one manuscript of Gilgamesh from the 7th century BC, which shows that the person writing it was a native speaker of Aramaic. So there's a sentence here you can see. This is Gilgamesh's mother is being described here, and what it is supposed to be then essentially is, you see here is written in the Sumerian Dumu Shah, which then in Akkadian is Mari Shah, her son, Mar like bar, then essentially in Aramaic. However, the scribe, not thinking, has written Belisha in Aramaic, in Akkadian, which means her lord. And this is because, of course, Aramaic mare, lord, sounds like mar, maru in Akkadian. So we see here that a scribe who was thinking in this language made this mistake without thinking. So it shows that there were Arameans who could have put this into Aramaic if they wanted to, but they didn't. There's no good evidence whatsoever of this so far, and rather we have very small-scale transmissions. One of these that I am discussing in an article of mine, which is about to come out, is that there is a fictitious letter of Gilgamesh in which, in fact, he speaks to the king of a distant eastern land. And this is very similar to a later fictitious letter by a Garmos, king of Babylonia, which is surviving in the letters of Apollonius of Tyana. It's somehow stuck in there. And as a result, one might suspect that this Garmos is actually a leftover of Gilgamesh in later tradition. And in fact, he also appears as the bad guy in the Babyloniaca of Iamblichus. Anyway, so these transmissions, here's the ones that I think are quite safe in terms of transmissions outside of cuneiform, and I'll run through them quickly before we get to Bar Konai, now to the main topic of this talk. And these are, in my opinion, and this comes from my article that's due to come out quite soon, making the last corrections to it. One has the appearance, it's very well known, of Gilgamesh and also of Humbaba in the Book of Giants, as discovered at Qumran. One also has a very strange reference to a gentleman called Gilgamesh in Josephus's Jewish Antiquities, which remarkably he appears in a genealogy in the place of Gershon, which is rather odd, as one of the sons of Jacob. Although it's very interesting because Josephus at this point says, and this is my proof that the Jews are from Babylonia and not Egypt. So it's possible he chose the name on purpose because it was more Mesopotamian. On top of that, we also have a reference to a Gilgamos, which we'll talk more about later, from Claudius Aelianus. In the Babylonian Talmud, there is a strange series of references to a type of wood called Golemish wood, which is interesting because, of course, It's a question in which it's asked, out of which wood was the ark made? And the answer is cedar wood, a special kind of cedar wood called Gilgamesh wood, and also appears as Galmesh wood and Golmosh wood. And this is rather interesting because, of course, Gilgamesh has something to do with cedar and something to do with the flood, as I've already mentioned. And, of course, also his name is written with the Gish sign, the sign for wood, in Akkadian, in cuneiform. So it's plausible that maybe some sort of Talmudic transcriber of an Akkadian list of names or similar thought that this was a plant and accidentally put it in the wrong file. Anyway, then there's Bar Kunai, who we're going to talk about in a minute, who has these very interesting references. And finally, there's a strange reference maybe to a demon called Jamjamish or Jamjamush in Jalaluddin al-Suyuti's Kitab Rahma. So that's all of our attestations. And if we map them, it looks like this. So from all of this, with the remaining 10 minutes that I have, I'm going to turn to Theodorus Bar Konai and his Katava, the Escolion. I've forgotten the long O's on Escolion, I'm sorry. And this is because it's often mentioned in Assyriological literature. Here is, for example, Andrew George in his large edition of Gilgamesh talks about this author, and this is normally cited, you'll even find it on Wikipedia, as the last attestation of Gilgamesh. And this is two kings, in fact, who are listed, Galmagos, and in a list in the second Mimra, entry number 120 of his Book of Scholia. And this is in response to a question as to who the kings were at the same time as the biblical patriarchs. And this is passed on in a whole load of secondary literature, but the thing that really struck me is that it hasn't received a proper investigation for a very long time by somebody with some sort of background in Syriac, and I have a little bit from my time at universities, enough hopefully to scrape by, at least for the sake of this argument. So I'd like then to investigate this a little bit more closely. If we look here at the reference, this is the edition from Seert by Scher, and we see here the whole text asking who these kings were from Nimrod, very interestingly, all the way to Abraham. And we see at the bottom these last kings. There's a very mixed bag of different rulers here, different strange names. Shamgar, of course, Shamgar appears in the Bible, so he's fine. But there's two gentlemen called Achlimon who also appear, which is very strange. So I might notice here. And then at the end, Gamigos or Gamnagos in another manuscript, and Ganmagos or Galmagos is in the 12th place. And between them is an interesting figure called Ogar, who we'll also talk about. So this is supposed to be this last attestation of Gilgamesh, but what on earth is it in reality? Well, interestingly, there's also another recension I've managed to find, and it's possible I've completely missed manuscripts, I apologize if so, in which there's only 10 kings rather than 12, and the final of these kings then is called Gamigamos. So rather far away from Gilgamesh, but still sounds quite Gilgamesh-like. Certainly Galmagos sounds somewhat like Gilgamesh, and we might suspect that this list with 10 kings is earlier. No? Because it's simpler and there's not this tautology of two kings with the same name appearing at the end. So this is what I would argue then. And if we then continue and look at this, I would argue, you might have already thought of this, you might have anticipated me on this point, that there's something rather Iranian about this list of names, because we have this Achlimon appearing twice, and this makes one suspect it might be Ahriman, no? The Manichaean evil deity. And this RL swap happens quite a lot between Persian words in Aramaic, as far as I can tell. And the second point is, of course, we have Gamigos, Gamnagos, Ganmagos, and Galmagos. Now, is it possible that a metathesis has happened here? That one has essentially, one's read from an original Galgamos, one has metaphysed it to Galmagos, and hence one now has a magus, no? This Persian word for a sort of a learned person, and that one sort of out of this old Gilgamesh name, they've sort of theorized that there must be a sort of a magus, a scholar of this name. And this is interesting if this isn't Interpretatio Iranica, as I suggest here, because of course Bar Konai discusses Manichaeism a huge amount. It's what his book of Scholia is most famous for, is its discussion of this. So that's one possible influence, and if so, it's particularly interesting because, as I already mentioned, Gilgamesh does appear at Qumran in the Book of Giants, which of course is a scripture which is then passed on into Manichaeanism. So this could be some strange sideways way that Gilgamesh makes his way into this list. And of course, the demon Jamjamish we talked about, it's also been argued by Reeves that there is a Manichaean background to this, but this is debatable and I am not qualified to judge on it. But anyway, if such, then that would be a possible route of transmission. There is another one, I'm sorry, this gets more complicated, which is that the grandfather of Gilgamesh is called Enmerkar in the Sumerian list of kings, and this king list actually is transmitted very late into Babylonian history, and if you can believe it, rather strikingly, the attestations in Berossus are of something like sort of Oiakhaios or similar, Evorchos, Oiaxios or similar, and Suachoros in the Elian Gilgamesh story we'll talk quickly about in a moment as we come to an end of my discussion of this text. But if so, it's also possible that maybe, especially because this is in the 12-king version, that there was some other strange list, possibly via Berossus or similar, in which this odd Ogar and the second Gilgamesh were appended to these 10 kings. But this is just speculation on my part. But it is this idea was already suggested quite a long time that Ogar is Enmerkar. This comes from Jakobson, so it's not my idea. But this is only interesting because then, of course, if we see there's this very famous story of Gilgamesh and the eagle, which just briefly to summarize, because we don't have a huge amount of time, this is a story that then Suachoros or Uekoros, this S disappears in some manuscripts, so it's thought that it may be an accidental addition, is told that his grandson will defeat him one day, so he guards his daughter, of course, now. This is the Perseus story, more or less. And what occurs in the end is that a child is stillborn, and then it's supposed to be thrown off a ziggurat or something similar, but an eagle catches it and rescues it, and this child then becomes Gilgamesh. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with the actual Gilgamesh story, as far as we can tell, but it's interesting because, of course, it would be, again, evidence for a transmission within a later source of one guy being the grandfather and the other the grandson, and that this might explain this list. But it's hard to say, and also, of course, they're listed one after one another. There's not a king in between. Anyway, so with all that, I'd like to bring it to my sort of conclusions of this, and I apologize because I've been very much moving in territory which I don't normally move in as an Assyriologist, but I hope at least that I've given you some food for thought, and you might be able to correct me on the points where I'm wrong. I'd like to conclude the following. Gilgamesh does not seem to be present as a mythical king, or he does seem to be present as a mythical king, but it's not connected to the epic I told you about at the beginning. He seems to just survive as a name, as a memory of a king, and possibly he might be tied to folk tales such as the story of the eagle we had there, which of course isn't actually connected to what's in the Gilgamesh story at all. And I think there's some Iranian influences there, and maybe this has passed through Manichaeanism out of the Dead Sea Scrolls or similar, but that isn't the only way it has to have come there at all. It's just a suggestion, and it might be very incorrect. I do think that this 10-king list is older than the weird 12-king list, and that this 12-king list might be because somebody had multiple lists of Mesopotamian kings, one maybe from Berossus and this other 10-king list, and tried to mash them together unsuccessfully. And there is one last thing I'd like to tease you with at the end, which is that, of course, Gamigamos sounds a little bit like Jamjam, if any of you are aware of the story of Sultan Jamjam, the Cumcime Name, as it's called in Turkish. And of course, this is a version, in the later versions, it's Christ who talks to Sultan Cumcime. In the original version, it's Saint Macarius, who we already had today, of course, alongside Ahiqar, which is an example of a successful Aramaic text in comparison to Gilgamesh here, in which an ancient king who wanted immortality is resurrected by either Christ or St. Macarius, talks about how he didn't manage immortality and then is brought back after a vision of hell to live life a second time. So one wonders if there might be a leftover in this because Gamigamos is so close to Jamjam. But anyway, this is speculation on my part, and we're down to the last minute. So I will finish by saying, of course, Gilgamesh actually is experiencing a new lease of life in real Neo-Aramaic. Now, as is well known, of course, the Gilgamesh magazine was very influential the early days of the sort of construction of modern Assyrian identity. There is a lovely statue of Gilgamesh which looks quite a lot like Nicholas Al-Jalou, in my opinion, down University of Sydney. And important also to mention, also because this is not my research and I'm not capable of doing it, but of course, William Daniel's very famous Katani Gabara is relevant to modern Neo-Aramaic speaking groups' identities, but there is the possibility that a much older narrative underlies this, and this could be a genuine transmission of some sort of Aramaic Gilgamesh-esque composition. However, until more work is done on these texts and what's left of the oral documentation, I can't be said for sure. I've reached my 20 minutes, and so I say Taudi. Thank you.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. Just one thing, the list has survived in many texts, actually, in the Syriac. It's part of the historiography. You find it in Birol, both in his chronicle and in his exegesis, actually, and in other historiographical texts. It is an essential part of the historiography of the Syriac tradition, even into Arabic as well. Agapius has it as well. The interesting thing is, of course, like you showed, the names are Birol, and the discussion is what lies behind whatever is there. So I can give you a few more strange versions of your names to add to your list, and it's up to you whether you read Gilgamesh in them or Cambirus, which is also been used.
Ooh,
but,
that's nice.
It probably goes back even to Polyhistor, so it's in Greek, and there, of course, Polyhistor uses Berosos, and that links with whatever may have been in Berosos. Of course, that is a problem. Well, we won't touch that.
Yes, but thank you very, very much for your comments. I'm very happy to know that, because you see, within Assyriological literature, only Bar Konai is always referenced. No? It's always Bar Konai, and I suspected there's much more to it, but I do not have the knowledge. So my logic was I would bring this to a large group of people doing Syriac, like so, and then they would tell me exactly where I'm wrong. So thank you very much. That's actually very good to know. A quick thing I would say about that, Berosos is a difficult kettle of fish, as you've said. Also, Alexander Polyhistor also has these long lists of Assyrian kings with strange, odd names, some of which fit real figures and others which are completely made up. And of course, in turn, I have the awful suspicion that the list of Phoenician kings by Menander of Tyre has gotten mixed in with that as well. Make it even worse. What we genuinely need, and in this age of joined up research as would be possible, would be to get all these lists, to have them in some way where they can be compared nicely digitally, and we can try and sift through them, because they started with something real. There's definitely a genuine list of kings underneath. The question is how it came to be. Thank you.
But even the manuscripts of the same text, well, you showed already.
Yes.
The same is true of the historiography. The manuscripts differ. The minute you have 4 manuscripts, you have 4 names.
Well, let's see how many names we have and let's compare them, shall we? But thank you.
Thank you. Now, the next question.
في كتاب صدر الأوراق ذكر في قصة الطوفان لنوح أنه الملك ازدباء الجبار اللي هو يعني جلجامش ذهب إلى أطراف تمنح الطوفان، وأكو لحن يمثل أنه مرسوم يعني موجود في المتحف البريطاني، يمثل جلجامش ليعبر الجهة الثانية يقابل الملك يعني قصدي نوح الطوفان أو تنبشتن. فأنت راجعت لنا ما طفت يعني راجع بالتوراة في قصة جلجامش
يا دكتورة إذا معناتها لازم نرجع المحاضرة بالعربي مش
لا قصدي يعني هو يعرف هذا المصدر بس
she mentions relief in the museum, in the British Museum, showing Gilgamesh crossing the water to go to Utanapishtim. So did you know this relief?
I have no knowledge of this relief. If this is a relief and not a cylinder seal or something like that, it's you mean a large relief?
أنت شو هو قلت هذا ريليف ولا صورة؟ ريليف. النحت هو ريليف. ما بعرف.
لا وهي يعني
ما بعرف مع الأسف.
يعني ضروري الواحد يتعرف على هذا يعني هو كتاب صدى التوراة.
لا هو طلع على اسم جلجامش في التاريخ عند باركوناي، يعني ما هو راح عند كل النصوص ما راح على النصوص المسمارية يعني. هو طلع بالأخير عند باركوناي اسم جلجامش من وين يعني.
هو الذي رأى كل شيء، ما أنا اسمه، هو الذي رأى كل شيء.
ما له علاقة بهاي، شو مكتوب عند باركوناي وبالمؤرخين الثانيين. So we would have to translate or to give your talk again in Arabic. And then you can discuss with the colleague from Erbil and most of the other colleagues.
بس أنا ماجستير ما في جلجامش كله.
She wrote a master on Gilgamesh, that's why.
I'm very sorry, I'm very ignorant of Arabic. I hope with more time I shall speak more of this very difficult but very beautiful language which you possess and I don't. But yes, thank you for your comment. I will have a look and see if there's any evidence of Gilgamesh on reliefs.
One more question? Yeah.
Thanks. Origin of the name Gilgamesh in Sumerian language. Big Bufalo. يعني كبير اسمه كبير الجاموس. راب
بوفالو.
كبير يعني إذا بالآرامية راب جاميش نفس التسمية يعني هذا أصل التسمية تكون
Thank you very much for that comment. Yes, thank you for that comment. The earliest attestation we have of Gilgamesh is not entirely as Gilgamesh, but as En-Mes. This is a character who has a similar event. En always means lord in Sumerian. Mes means young men or youths. Later, we have the name Gilgamesh, and there the Gilga part has been very debated what this means. It could mean offspring, son, or similar, and Mes again is connected to young men or heroes. And in the story of Gilgamesh and Ahiqar, he is the spokesperson for the young men of Uruk. So it seems to be connected to youth. It is also important to mention briefly, there have been some other ideas such as that Gilga might have something to do with a plant or similar that's to do with eternal life, but I don't believe in this. It is worth saying that sometimes Gilgamesh's name appears without the Mes element, so just Gilga. So I think that the Mes is almost like maybe a title, like Gilga the hero, young Gilga, strong Gilga. But this is debated, of course, but this is how I would interpret it.
No, he means now there is a view in Gilgamesh. Gul, that's meaning a head of buffalo. Or like a big buffalo.
In Sumerian?
Now a view for some researchers that say buffalo, gamush, gul, gamush, that buffalo, that means.
This is the later. This would be gamush. Would be very nice. This would be Aramaic.
It's possible that they reinterpreted the name,
yes.
But it would not be the Sumerian. There was no Aramaic back when his name was invented. Thank you for comment.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, here is the last presentation. Shemunkasho, and the title of the talk is the 150th anniversary of the visit of Patriarch Peter IV to Queen Victoria.
I think after 3 talks, we have to overcome our physiological demands, and you will be tired. You heard so much about Gilgamesh, so he should come talk to you, or Ahiqar, or I should read a piece of the Talmud to you so that you could probably gain much more. Maybe I stand up for a minute and we'll have a look to the neighbors and talk a few words to wake up again before I start talking, because the danger is after such a long day it's time to sleep or to go to sit for supper.
Okay, we'll start.
So, and meanwhile will be also the PowerPoint presentation ready and I can start. So, thank you. So the visit of Patriarch Peter IV. So
the break is very short.
So I hope I can keep you awake for the next 20-25 minutes. So the visit of Patriarch Peter IV to Queen Victoria in March 1875, 150 years ago, has been kept alive among many Syriac as well as among some British people due to the following reasons. From the Syriac point of view, the fact that the Syriac Orthodox Church received 2 printing presses after the patriarchal visit to London, the printing presses are understood as being a gift from Queen Victoria personally. In this way, the historical visit was put in a positive context and has been kept alive until today as common memory. This memory has been sustained through 3 still present actualities. First one is the printing of books. The printing presses in Mardin and Jerusalem produced a large number of books at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. It was a norm to have printed books at that time. Often, they were considered even much more important than the handwritten manuscript. Using the printed books, the students, teachers, and clergy heard the story of how the Syriac Patriarch had visited London and the British Queen gifted him the printing presses. Second factor is the visiting 2 monasteries, and one of them is Mor Hananio, the Zahfaran, the previous patriarchal see near Mardin. The guided to always lead the tourists and the visitors to the printing press, where part of it still can see in, and this is a picture of it. The same and the third factor is in Jerusalem. Also, there a part of the printing presses can be seen. Thus, many books were printed in this time, and they were used in the schools and in the churches in the prayers. And also, the Hechemso, the patriarchal journals, was published and printed in the printing press. Now, as collective memory among the Syriac, the story is summarized as my uncle personally, I heard it from him many times, Aho Shemunkasho, used to tell it. Now he passed away, but last week I heard it again from our neighbor, Hanne Goktash, who is from Tur Abdin, Sederi village, but living today in Ferl in Germany. And he put it as such: when the patriarch visited the queen, she asked him, "What is your wish?" He answered, "We need help for a printing press." She answered, "Is this all?" Our neighbor Hanne Goktash opened his hands and giggled, implying, for what else could he ask for? The patriarch is the head of a suffering church, and it was not realistic to ask for a military support to help in forming a state or to strengthen the Syriac people or the notion of a nation. Also, the educational aid was delayed and came much later after the historical visit. The printing presses were directly linked with the Queen Victoria in a colloquial memory, and this is understood as the main motivation for the visit and the main outcome of it. The other reasons behind the visit of Patriarch Peter IV to Queen Victoria fade away in the collective memory of the Syriac. Now, from British side, as the visit of Patriarch Peter IV to Queen Victoria is documented in the British Archive and is visible in the portrait of Patriarch Peter IV hanging in Lambeth Palace, the representatives of the Church of England dealing with the Eastern Christianity are very much aware of the impression Patriarch Peter IV left in England. In the last few years, I visited the Bishop of London, Bishop Richard Charters, twice in the House of Lords. And last November, I met Bishop Christopher Cockworth in Windsor, who is the deanery of the King's Free Chapel of St. George. Likewise, I talked to Dr. Jeremy Morris, who is the National Advisor for Ecumenical Relationship of the Church of England, as well as to William Henry Taylor, who published his book, Antioch and Canterbury, the Syrian Orthodox Church and the Church of England, 1874 to 1928. They gave me the impression that they are also very much aware of the visit of Patriarch Peter IV to England, and particularly about the meeting with Archbishop Tide of Canterbury and with Queen Victoria. Next to his portrait on plaque in Lambeth Palace, Patriarch Peter IV is remembered as a very faithful and learned man, I quote, who knew the Bible by heart, as they put it, and he prayed over the tomb of Prince Albert at Queen Victoria's request. Now I am using this conference as an ideal place to commemorate this 150th anniversary of the visit, and I would like to draw your attention to 3 points. First of all, to the life and little bit work of Peter IV. Secondly, to the reasons why he was motivated to travel to England. And thirdly, to his journey to England and his meeting with the Archbishop and with the Queen. Now to the point one. There is not a lot known about the early life of Patriarch More Ignatius Peter IV. He was born as Petrus ibn Salmon Misko in Mosul in 1798, but traveled to Tur Abdin, studied in the monastery of Deir Zahfaran, and became a monk and priest there. Patriarch Ignatius Elias II ordained him as a bishop for Damascus and gave him the title Julius in 1846. In Syria, he reclaimed and gained several churches and monasteries from the Syriac Catholics. In addition, there was a great dispute with the Armenian about properties, and he had to deal with them. When More Ignatius Elias II died in 1871, Bishop Julius was in Constantinople. Due to political difficulties, he couldn't attend the funeral, and also he couldn't come back to take part in the election of the next patriarch. Already in the same year, the Synod unanimously elected him as in absentia as the next patriarch, which he didn't want to accept first, but later he did. The intronization as the 116th Patriarchate of Antioch took place on 16 June 1872 in Jerusalem in St. Marcus Church there on the day of Pentecost. On the way to the Patriarchal See in Deir Zahfaran, he visited Omi Diyarbakir. ordained Rabban Abdul Satruf as Bishop Mor Gregorius for Jerusalem, but then he sent him to Constantinople for a short time and asked him to accompany him on his journey to Britain. Tirelessly, he dealt with the challenges the Syriac Orthodox Church faced in the Ottoman Empire, as well as in India. For instance, he tried very hard to get official recognition of the Syriac Church as an independent millet within the Ottoman Empire. Patriarch Peter IV initiated a major reconstruction of the Deir al-Zahfaran monastery. And with his focus on education and schools, he wanted to lead the church in the new era. The printing press was a part of this plan. After the Syriac Orthodox Patriarch Ignatius Ni'mat Allah in the 16th century, who was forced to abdicate and fled to Europe in 1576, this is now Abdullah Ni'mat, took part in the reformation of the Julian calendar that became the Gregorian calendar in 1582. The next Syrian Orthodox Patriarch who came to Europe is Mor Ignatius Peter IV. He is the first patriarch who actively planned his journey and came to England to gain some support for the benefits of his church. He is also the first patriarch who traveled to India to solve the divisions that appeared there through the missionaries. In the context of restructuring the Syriac Orthodox Church in Malabar and establishing a new episcopal governance, Patriarch Ephraim Barsom in his Birol Bzire mentioned only once Patriarch Peter IV, and he say Patriarch Peter IV issued decrees and canons laws for the leadership of the church in India during the Synod of Mulanturusi in 1877. On his way back from India, Patriarch Peter IV stopped in Egypt and then went to Istanbul. He died at the age of 96 in Deir al-Zahfaran on 8 October 1894. Now, many of his letters and those which he received in the Patriarchal Archive in Mardin, but also there is a lot of communication and reports on him in Lambeth Palace and other archives. And here is a list where one can gain short information about him, but I would like to draw your attention to two studies which give enough information to get good idea about Peter IV. And this is the work of William Henry Taylor, Antioch and Canterbury, the Syrian Orthodox Church and the Church of England in 1874 until 1928, as well as from Syriac side is from Khalid Said Dinno, the Syrian Orthodox Christian in the late Ottoman, post-Ottoman periods, and his chapter 3 deals exactly with the visit of Peter IV to England. To understand fully the full story and in context of time, I'm sure there's a lot of work need to be done and to analyze much more in work and the archives to get a better idea about Peter IV. Now coming to the second point, why did Patriarch Peter IV travel to Britain and visit the Queen? Faith were not just of a political nature due to the local powers, but also to religious nature due to the Western missionary work. With the appearance of the Western missionary, Syriac Christians witnessed serious interference with their own historical and apostolic church. This was the case in particular with the Portuguese, started already in the 16th century. In the 19th century, the American Protestant missionaries as well as the British missionaries reached the Syriac Christian in southern India, and their interest in Syriac church certainly grew, particularly with the publication of Claudius Buchmann's book, Christian Researches in Asia in 1811. British missionaries operated through the Church Missionary Society, CMS, and aimed to bring the Thomas Christian under the doctrinal hegemony of the Church of England. At the beginning, they built a good ecumenical relationship. After splitting from Rome, the Church of England was interested in getting in full communion with another apostolic church and in claiming its apostolic authenticity and being fully recognized as a sister church. For the Syrian Christian, it was important to get support in the dispute with the Catholic missionaries who had divided the Syriac church in southern India, but also in the Middle East. According to Taylor and Dino, Buchanan promoted a full and formal union between both churches. The Syriac church cooperated and accepted educational aid from CMS missionaries in India. Gradually, the missionaries tried to reform the Syriac church according to their doctrinal theology, particularly through Abraham Malpan, who sent his nephew Joseph Matthew to Mardin to study there and become a bishop. He returned to India in 1843 as Mar Athanasius, and his name we have to remember it, who claimed authority from the Patriarch Jacob II, who ordained him and acted in disobedience against local head of the Syriac church in India, particularly against the Metropolitan More Dionysius, at the beginning More Dionysius IV, and then later More Dionysius V. CMS missionaries continued with their support to Mar Athanasius, but not with Metropolitan Mar Dionysius. This caused division in the church, and the complaint reached Patriarch Elias II already in the 1830s and 40s, then Patriarch Jacob in the 1850s and 60s, and also Patriarch Peter IV in his time. With the hope of solving the conflict, Metropolitan More Dionysius V invited Patriarch Peter V to come to India and solved out the problem. Accepting such an invitation, the Patriarch decided to visit England to get permission to travel to India as the British colony and secure certain support in reunifying his church. Thus, solving the dispute in South India and maintaining the orthodoxy of Syrian Christianity there was the main motivation to travel to London. Other motivations are locally in the Ottoman Empire. The Patriarch had extreme challenges to preserve the historical identity of his church, not just in India but also in the Ottoman Empire. Mar Gregorius, the Bishop of Jerusalem, met the Patriarch in Constantinople and traveled with him to England. In his diary, he writes about the worries Patriarch Peter IV had. One of them was the millet system, as the Syriac church was not recognized as an independent entity, but as a part of the Armenians, and this led to property disputes in many locations, particularly in Jerusalem. The property dispute was also with the Syriac Catholic, who were supported by the French and were accepted as a millet due to the intervention of Western politicians. It is not obvious if Patriarch Peter IV planned to talk about this during his visit to England, and if he expected any intervention from Britain. Inevitably, this issue was addressed and mentioned in some of the corresponding letters between him and his counterparts. Thirdly, here, the Patriarch expected educational aid in building schools for boys and girls, improving the theological seminary, and setting up a printing press as mentioned above. Particularly, the first 2 points put a lot of pressure on the Patriarch, so that he visited British Embassy in Istanbul on 16 April 1874. Consul General Sidney Lowcock wrote to Foreign Secretary Lord Derby, informing him about the new election of the Patriarch, his recognition by Sultan Abdulaziz through a legal document firman, and his wish is to, and he put it as such, I quote, visit England for the purpose of obtaining from Her Majesty's governmental letters to the British authorities in India, desiring them to recognize him as Patriarch of the Syrian Church in the British province, where I understood the Syriac community is reckoned to be up to 2 million of souls. End of quote. Later, the Patriarch approached also the Reverend George Curtis, who served as the Church of Galata in Istanbul, and asked him to write to Archbishop Archibald Campbell Tait, the Archbishop of Canterbury. He wrote to the Archbishop as well as to the Secretary of the Society of Propagation of the Gospel on 16 June 1874, stating the main two reasons of his travels. I'm not going to quote them now. At the same time, the Patriarch asked for permission from the Sultan to travel to England, and he got it. It seems that the Armenians tried to stop his visit, and they claimed that the reason for the trip to England was a planned union of the Syriac Church with the Church of England. This claim was denounced in an article in the Times newspaper already in October 16, 1874. Now to the third point. Patriarch Peter IV and more Gregorius Abdullah Satov departed from Constantinople in August 14th aboard a ship to England and arrived 10 days later there. The media noticed already in September the visit of the Patriarch and made it publicly in the newspaper like The Guardian on 16 September or in the Times, as I mentioned above. The newspaper also accurately gave the reasons of the visit, solving out the problem of the Syriac Church in India. This was clear for Archbishop Tait and made his position very much clear too. Based on the information he received from the ecclesiastical authorities in India, such as from the Bishop of Calcutta and Madras, some of their letters were written already in March of the same year, namely few years before the Patriarch started his thorny journey. As the Church of England, the Archbishop was in support of More Athanasius and not of More Dionysius, which means not in the support of the Patriarch. The Patriarch met for the first time the Archbishop right at the Abingdon Park on the 15th September 1874 and gave him a copy of the Firman issued on 30th December 1873, in which the legal authority of the Patriarch about the Syriac Church was confirmed, where was clearly stated, and I quote three citations here. First, none shall oppose him, namely the Patriarch, either in his appointments or depositions. Second, no one belonging to a different community shall interfere with him. All matters, moreover concerning the endowment of the church and convents, shall be adjusted with the consent of the Patriarch, without the least interference of any belonging to a different community. Third, should a bishop, a priest, or monk prove faithless to his vows and tenets, the Patriarch shall cause their hair to be shaved and shall oppose them. The Archbishop Tait was impressed by such authority, but nevertheless he read the statement he received from the Anglican bishop there and underlined their confirmation of Athanasius as the authentic bishop representing the Syriac Church in Malabar. The Archbishop holds the opinion that it must be very difficult to rule over a church in India that is so far from Antioch, and the Patriarch should let the local bishop take their own decision independent of the Patriarch and remain just nominally attached to him without authority, as it is the case with the 170 bishops of the Church of England. With the public support of more Dionysius, Archbishop Tite questioned the whole reality of the patriarchal authority of the Christians in Malabar, thus there were no consents and not support. In a letter to the Foreign Secretary, Lord Derby, in October, the Patriarch mentioned the political situation in the Ottoman Empire and pointed out to the support the Catholics get by the Pope and the French, and thought the Britain could do the same for the Syrians. This political issue was avoided by the British governors totally, but informed the Governor-General of India that the Patriarch is going to come for a visit in regard to his jurisdiction. So far, no success in the above-mentioned two issues. The Patriarch visited the Society for Promotion of Christian Knowledge on 17 November 1874 and asked for educational aid. He speaks here about establishing schools, as I mentioned above, and I'm not going to read them, but also establishing a seminary for training people and having a printing press. In regard to the dispute in India, the Patriarch and the Archbishop did not change their position, but they came to a compromise that the British authority should remain neutral and not get involved. Also, in regard to reference in matters of properties in the Ottoman Empire, the British authority point out to their neutrality. Thus, the request of the Patriarch were turned down, and the tension between him and Lord Derby and between him and the Archbishop Tite grew gradually. By the end of January and beginning of February, both of them recommended him to leave the country as soon as possible. Archbishop Tite states on 2nd of February, I quote, "It is not desirable that the Patriarch and his attendants remain longer in this country than is absolutely necessary." End of quotation. The Patriarch did not give up and wrote to the Archbishop again on 15th February using harsh tone. When, I quote, "When you have distinguished between the good and the evil, you will decide justly," and stated that the Patriarch did not ask for political interference in Ottoman Empire, but just for quote, friend words of kindness in accordance with the treaties and with the laws, end of quotation. I need a minute and a half, then I finish. Finally, with the agreement of no discussion of political issue, the Patriarch could meet the Queen Victoria on March the 8th in Windsor. The Dean of Windsor, Very Reverend Wellesley, documented it as such. "Everything went off well, as I desired. The interpreter was not to touch upon any political controversies topics. Indeed, the old man preserved an oriental serenity and did not seem eager to force any of his interest upon the Queen. He kissed her hand on entering the presence and then made one of two flourishing speeches about the Christian Queen, and she, on her part, kindly expressed a wish for the diffusion of education among her Indian suspects under his charge. Afterwards, I took him to St. George Chapel. The Queen, however, she was much taken by his venerable appearance that she had asked to send for him again before leaving England. The Patriarch visited the Queen a second time a week later on March the 12th in the mausoleum at Frogmore, and there were no discussion about any topics. Finally, this meeting led to agreement between the Archbishop and the Patriarch on various things, and then they also started writing to each other again in positive manner and establishing the society to help the Syriac Patriarch and sent him educational ad. I stop here because of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Maybe we should finish. Yeah, the time is already over. So I ask you guys to continue discussion after the session. Yeah. Thank you. And have a nice time.